Hey, well, welcome everyone. Good evening, good morning, and for some, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a special 21 JPSI webinar event on the U.S. Japan Alliance in 2023, co-sponsored with the CSIS Japan Chair. My name is Adam Liff, and I'm hosting this event from Indiana University, and in my capacity as Director of the 21st Century Japan Politics and Society Initiative here at our Hamilton Luger School of Global and International Studies. Now, for those of you joining one of our events for the first time, welcome. Our mission here at 21 JPSI is to encourage and support research, teaching, and public discussions about pressing issues in contemporary Japanese politics, society, and international relations, and to serve as a Midwestern hub for the study of Japan's domestic and foreign policy challenges. 21 JPSI was established in 2018 with support from a generous seed grant from the Japan Foundation, which is also providing financial support for our webinar tonight. Please check out our website to learn more. Now, I'm especially excited about tonight's event because it marks my first virtual collaboration with Chris Johnstone of CSIS, where since this past summer, he has been serving as Senior Advisor and Japan Chair. As many of you in the audience already know, Chris joined CSIS after a distinguished 25-year career in a variety of senior U.S. government positions focused on U.S. policy toward Japan and the Indo-Pacific. Thank you again, Chris, for partnering with us tonight. Before we get started, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Good evening and good morning to everyone. I am Chris Johnstone. I'm the Senior Advisor and Japan Chair at CSIS, and it's really a great privilege to co-host this event with Adam today, a good friend, someone whose counsel I found valuable when I was in government. So it's a particularly meaningful opportunity for me to be on this side with him for this event. Adam is really one of the leading lights in the field, so it's a terrific privilege. Also glad to be here with such a great group of panelists. I think this is an exceptionally dynamic time in Japan. I think the most dynamic time I can remember, frankly, on the national security front. Next week, Prime Minister Kishida will visit Washington. There will also be a 2+2 meeting of foreign and defense ministers. So this is a really ideal time for this event. So again, it's my privilege to be here and look forward to a really great discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Beyond a reflection on Japan's new national security strategy, our panel tonight will also discuss the rapidly changing security environment in East Asia, as well as implications for U.S.-Japan allied priorities in the new year. So to explore these important issues, we're extremely pleased to welcome an all-star binational lineup of experts. Full bios are available online at the link I just posted in the chat. So let me just provide a quick overview of tonight's game plan before we dive into the substance. So each panelist has been asked to offer up to 8 minutes of prepared remarks on a specific topic, just so we can try to cover as much ground as possible in the time we have together this evening. After those remarks, I'll have the privilege of moderating a discussion among the group before we open things up for questions from all of you, our global audience. Now, I already have a number of questions in the hopper that came in through the registration page. Thanks to those of you who already sent those in. And we'll also open up the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window for live questions later after the panelists finish their remarks. So the topical division of labor tonight will be as follows. To provide some scene setting and context for the more future-oriented discussion to follow, I'll kick things off with an overview of changes in the regional security environment since Japan's first national security strategy way back in 2013, with a particular focus on what by almost all accounts was a significant worsening of the security environment during 2022. Next, Chris Johnstone of CSIS and Satoru Mori of Keio University will provide their forward-looking analysis of the implications of Japan's 3 new national security documents and offer their thoughts on U.S.-Japan alliance priorities, both at the upcoming summit and for the remainder of 2023. Now, after they've spoken, we'll hear from Sumi Terry of the Wilson Center, who will share her thoughts on what to expect from North Korea in 2023, as well as prospects for enhanced trilateral cooperation among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea in confronting regional security challenges. And last but not least, Kristen Vakasi from the University of Maine will share her perspective on Japan's approach to economic security in the context of competition with China, as well as prospects and challenges for deeper U.S.-Japan cooperation, specifically in the economic security space. So many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Without further ado, let's dive in. Okay, so am I still screen sharing? We're all good? Okay. So let me now take off my host hat and I'll put on my panelist hat. My marching orders are to leave forward-looking analyses about what comes next to my fellow panelists. And to set them up, I'd like to highlight up front that the first few pages of Japan's new national security and defense strategies paint a picture of a region and world that, to quote from the documents themselves, presents the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II. That's a quote. Now, this judgment is not entirely new. For example, then Prime Minister Abe Shinzo used identical language in his 2018 New Year's Day address. But I think it's worth noting that no remotely similar language appeared in Japan's last national security strategy back in 2013, which in retrospect really seems like a much simpler time. Against a starkly different geopolitical and geoeconomic backdrop today, it's abundantly clear that Japan's leaders have now judged the region and world have fundamentally changed in some important ways, and that Japan's security posture, policies, and perhaps most significantly, even its defense spending must adapt in response. A series of very sobering developments in the regional and global security space during 2022 in particular seem to have convinced Japanese leaders that there's no time to waste. Put another way, if these documents had come out just 1 year earlier, I think it's likely that their content would have been very different. So since time is limited, let me focus my brief overview of Japan's changing security environment on the government's evolving descriptions of the challenges posed by the three countries that dominated Japanese security discussions during 2022, China, North Korea, and Russia. Now, way back at the time of Japan's first national security strategy in 2013, China had passed Japan to become the world's second largest economy just 3 years earlier. Now, to be sure, there were already deepening concerns in Tokyo about many of Beijing's policies, especially its rapidly increasing military expenditures, which at that point were already roughly 3 times the size of Japan's. Perhaps the most pressing concern at the time was what the 2013 strategy referred to as Beijing's attempts to change the status quo by coercion. Now, this was primarily in reference to China's efforts to assert its sovereignty claims in the East and South China Seas, especially in what Japan refers to as the gray zone. And needless to say, a lot has changed over the past decade, especially as it concerns China's rapidly expanding military capabilities. But from the perspective of today, I think what is perhaps most worth noting is that 10 years ago, Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait were largely an afterthought in Japanese security and U.S. Japan alliance discussions. And this was understandable. 2013 was a little more than halfway through an 8-year period of remarkably positive and stable ties under KMT President Ma Ying-jeou. And the U.S.-China balance of power had not yet shifted so significantly. To put it simply, it was a very different time across the Taiwan Strait. I think it's quite revealing, in fact, that the first reference in Japan's 2013 strategy to the Taiwan Strait actually highlights that, quote, the relationship between both sides has deepened. Now, circumstances have changed dramatically over the past 7 years, and especially over the last 3, as Beijing has ramped up coercive pressure on Taipei. As most of our audience is probably aware, Japan's westernmost and inhabited island is less than 70 miles from Taiwan's east coast. So even separating out a vast array of complicated political questions about Taiwan's status, geographical proximity and economic interests alone give Japan a huge stake in peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. Beijing's increasing pressure on Taipei over the past few years is hardly limited to the military domain, though that is perhaps what's been most conspicuous. 2022 marked a significant escalation, setting new records for PLA aircraft entering Taiwan's air defense identification zone, including over 100 entries by bombers. And China closed out the year with a quote-unquote strike exercise on Christmas that set new single-day records for the total number of PLA aircraft deployed and the 47 that crossed the so-called median line, an informal boundary between the two sides. Now, viewed from Japan, perhaps the most jarring example of China's military coercion against Taiwan last year were the PLA's massive military exercises in early August. These exercises included missile tests splashing down in zones only about 50 miles from Japanese territory, including 2 zones effectively sandwiching Yonaguni. In total, 5 PLA missiles splashed down in Japan's exclusive economic zone that week. And against this backdrop of a rapidly changing balance of power, both across the Taiwan Strait and in the wider region, by the end of 2022, Japan's national security strategy had moved beyond the language about China in its 2013 predecessor. After some negotiations within the ruling coalition, the new document stopped short of calling China a security threat, but still identifies China's policies as, quote, and here the translation's a bit awkward, presenting an unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge in ensuring the peace and security of Japan and the international community. Now, this is the official provisional translation released by the government. I had to quote, but for any Japanese speakers in the audience, the key phrase here is "koremade ni nai saidai no senyaku na chousen de aru." Now, Prime Minister Kishida reiterated this exact language in his December press conference, which suggests that it is here to stay. Now, turning to North Korea, Sue, of course, is the real expert on the call, so I'll just retrospectively highlight some changes since 2013. Most importantly, since Japan's first national security strategy, North Korea has carried out nearly 200 missile tests and tested 3 nuclear weapons, including a self-described thermonuclear test in 2017 with a reported yield of over 140 kilotons. Though 2022 did not witness a widely expected 7th nuclear test, Pyongyang shattered its previous record for annual missile tests last year, launching roughly 70 in total of various types, including multiple ICBMs. A particular concern for Japan, these included an October test that flew over Japanese territory, the first time that had happened since the US and North Korea were on the brink of war in summer 2017. Now, for these reasons, Japan's new national security strategy identifies North Korea's military activities as, and here again, I'm quoting from the document, an even more grave and imminent threat to Japan's national security strategy than ever before. And though I haven't seen this get too much attention in the press, I think it's worth noting that the document also highlights the, quote, confrontation between South and North Korea, suggesting that concerns in Tokyo about Pyongyang are not limited to fears of possible aggression directly against Japan, but also the possibility of instability on the peninsula. Lastly, I'd like to briefly highlight perhaps the most unexpected change from the standpoint of 2013, and that is how Japan's 2022 strategy talks about Russia. The 2013 document contained only 3 sentences on Russia, 2 of which actually emphasized the importance of Tokyo cooperating with Moscow, including security cooperation. The 3rd sentence back then does note the important dispute over the northern territories and calls for vigorous negotiations, but that's basically it. That's also understandable. Back in December 2013, Russia had not yet annexed Crimea, much less launched a full-scale and unprovoked military invasion of a sovereign UN member state. Meanwhile, outside some specialist circles, concerns in Japan about deepening China-Russia cooperation were hardly mainstream. Fast forward to 2022, when the world witnessed not only the shocking brutality of Russia's war of choice against Ukraine, but also nuclear threats, and closer to home, an uptick in Russia-China joint military patrols, including with bombers in areas very close to Japanese territory. Now, in this new era, it's not particularly surprising that Japan's Russian neighbors' actions loom large in Tokyo's new national security strategy. I believe it's extraordinarily important that the sentence immediately following the one I mentioned earlier, the one about Japan's security environment now being the worst since World War II, reads as follows. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has easily breached the very foundation of the rules that shape the international order. The next sentence basically paraphrases Prime Minister Kishida's frequent refrain last year that what is happening in Ukraine today could happen in East Asia tomorrow. So to wrap up, the region and world have changed a lot since Japan's first national security strategy in 2013, especially in just the 12 months leading up to Japan's release of its new one in December. If for no other reasons than its proximity to Russian-occupied territory, North Korea's military activities in the Taiwan Strait, Japan lives in a dangerous neighborhood that does not seem to be getting better. And I think that's important context for reflecting on these documents and for thinking about what comes next for the alliance. Now, as our next speaker knows better than anyone, though it's been 9 years since Japan's last national security strategy, the US and Japan have hardly stood still in the interim. The past decade has witnessed important changes to Japan's security policy, its domestic institutions and laws, JSDF force structure and posture, and the extent of Japan's security cooperation with the US, Australia, and many others. But there does seem to be a lot in these new documents that potentially will mark 2022 as a profoundly significant turning point. So to share his views on the big picture implications of these documents and what should come next, let me now turn things over to Chris Johnstone of CSIS for an American perspective, and he'll be followed by Satoru Mori from Keio University to offer a Japanese perspective on the same. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Adam. I thought that was a really terrific laydown of the strategic environment and what has sort of been behind and motivating the changes that we've seen reflected in Japanese policy. So I'm going to try to put a little bit of context around why I think what was announced in December was so significant for U.S. Japan context. And then I'll talk a little bit about a couple of challenges that I see going forward that I think await us in the future. So first, I think it's important to just start by recognizing how historic Japan's announcements were on December 16th. There's been a lot of hyperbole in the press that's been used to describe Japan's new strategic documents that were announced. I happen to think that a lot of the hyperbole is warranted and justified by the significance of what Japan has done. As someone who's been involved in the U.S.-Japan alliance for a long time, it's rare to be able to use the word unprecedented to describe something that Japan has said it will do. And frankly, in all of my years working on the alliance at the Pentagon and at the White House, I never thought change like what was announced last month was possible. And I think, frankly, my counterparts in the Foreign Ministry, the Defense Ministry, the National Security Secretariat also have been surprised that this level of change has proven to be possible. Japan's defense policy and alliance politics in general throughout the post-war period have been characterized by incrementalism, slow clicks of the dial that over time, if you stick around long enough, add up to real change, but at every given moment don't seem like they're amounting to much. And the best example of this, of course, is the 50-year cap on Japanese defense spending at about 1% of GDP. This was frequently a source of frustration among those of us on the policy side in Washington over the years, but the prospect that it would change in a fundamental way was something that didn't seem likely, to say the least. This was a policy that was first announced formally in 1976, lifted formally in 1977, but in a de facto way stayed in place ever since, with only a couple of times in history where spending poked above 1% of GDP. This was true even during the Abe years. For all the talk that we give about the transformative impact of Abe Shinzo on Japan's security policy, the budget was really not part of that transformation. In fact, he spent the first 2 years of his time in office of his second term, so from 2012 to 2014, simply working to get Japanese defense spending back to the level it was in 1997. So 15 years later, Japanese spending on defense is about this, gets back to where it was. Abe made important legal and policy changes, to be sure, but not much changed materially, I would argue. And that's what the policy announcements on December 16th really represent. If implemented, material change that will transform Japan's defense posture and transform the defense alliance. The planned growth in defense spending, 60% over 5 years, is unprecedented, and I think it's fair to call it norm shattering. And when my Japanese counterparts first began to raise with me about just over a year ago the possibility that the government would pursue this, frankly, I was pretty skeptical. What's also different, of course, are the capabilities that Japan has announced that it will acquire, and in particular, the so-called counterattack capabilities, counterstrike capabilities, long-range precision strike missiles, and Washington's commitment to support Japan's acquisition of those capabilities. This, too, breaks with tradition. As part of Japan's post-war defense policy, it has largely forsworn what we call power projection capabilities, bombers, aircraft carriers, and missiles. So this is a departure from that tradition. And in the document, it's not just counter-attack capabilities. There's also, I take note of, hasn't gotten as much attention, the cyber capabilities that Japan seeks to develop, including an active defense cyber capability, which would enable Japan, if implemented, to get inside the networks of potential adversaries and respond to an attack. The other thing that's critically different here is how Washington has changed about all this. The White House, the Defense Department, the State Department, all made statements, issued statements formally endorsing and welcoming Japan's new defense strategies on December 16th. I'm not aware of that happening before. And in truth, I mean, I think this speaks to a level of confidence in Japan as an ally, and speaks to the concern in Washington about the regional security environment that Adam so effectively described. I think a few years ago, it's fair to say there would have been much more resistance inside the Pentagon and inside the White House to the idea of supporting Japan in acquiring some of these capabilities. And now the overarching theme in Washington is seeking more empowered and more capable allies. We see this in the approach to South Korea. We see this in the approach to Australia, and some of the support for things like nuclear submarines. And now we see it with Japan. Now, there are lots of caveats to all of this, of course, that my colleagues will also speak to. There will continue to be constraints on Japan's military activity. There are questions about timelines for implementation and resourcing, and we'll no doubt talk about some of that. But let's not lose sight of the fact that this is dramatic, unprecedented change in the post-war period. Now let me say a couple of words about challenges, I think, going forward before I turn it over to Mori Sensei. First, for Japan, what I see is really a challenge of prioritization in the years ahead. This is a substantial increase in funding by any measure, as I've said, but Japan has also set out a long list of things that it intends to do. If you look at the budget requests specifically that accompanied these documents in December, there's 7 areas that Japan indicates are focus of the buildup. And they range from the strike capability I've mentioned, air and missile defense, cyberspace and other cross-domain capabilities, command and control and intelligence, lift capability, uncrewed systems. The point is, this is a lot. This is a lot that Japan has set out that it wants to do. And so trade-offs will inevitably be necessary. 2 areas in particular have gotten a lot of focus, and I think this is appropriate. The strike focus, if you look at the budget, 5 trillion yen over 5 years, $50 billion US almost, dedicated to building out strike capability. That signals, I think, real intent to make this a credible capability, and I think is welcome. And it will require a lot of cooperation with the United States to get there. Second area that gets a lot of focus is an area they call sustainability. So this is things like munitions stocks, maintenance and readiness for aircraft, parts. Also a very welcome focus, because these are areas that traditionally Japan has under-resourced, but are critical to an ability to respond quickly to a crisis. So I think keeping a focus on those 2 things will be important, particularly in the near term. But this is a daunting agenda, and I think keeping a clear sense of priority will be critical. Challenge for the United States is to recognize that the changes Japan has announced mean that the alliance must change too. This is an inflection point for Washington as much as it is for Tokyo, I would argue. Japan's acquisition of new capabilities, especially strike and cyber, and plans for a much more robust operational program with the United States will require a more integrated alliance than we have today. Quite simply, any scenario in which Japan is contemplating the use of long-range missiles is almost certainly a scenario in which the U.S. is also taking military action. And so the ability to coordinate military operations in real time in a dynamic environment will be critical to develop. And frankly, we are not well postured today to do so. In fact, the U.S. command structure, the structure of U.S. forces in Japan remains rooted in some ways in the legacy of the post-war period, and a time when Japan, where military cooperation was not the priority that it will be going forward. So we will need an ability to coordinate military operations in Japan. We will need a counterpart operational command for Japan's new joint operational command, and those things do not exist today, but represent a huge opportunity for the relationship going forward. I would also note this will also require closer cooperation with the Republic of Korea and the U.S. Republic of Korea alliance as well, particularly as we think about the potential for a contingency involving North Korea. So this is an opportunity to rethink and update the structure and mechanisms of the alliance to reflect a much more capable partner that's coming. There's so much more to talk about, but I'll stop there and turn it over to Mori Sensei, and I'm sure we'll have a great discussion going forward. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank Adam, Chris, for having me at this event. It's a real privilege to be able to speak among distinguished panelists. And I also want to thank everyone in the audience for participating in this event. So I've been tasked to provide a Japanese perspective on two topics. First, Japan's recently released 3 strategic documents. And second, implications and tasks ahead for the Japan-US alliance. So with regard to the national security strategy, I want to quickly make 2 general points. My first point is that, as Adam mentioned earlier, the Japanese government identified China as the main security challenge by declaring that it presents an unprecedented and the greatest strategic challenge in ensuring the peace and security of Japan and the peace and stability of the international community. I believe this perception of China aligns well with that of the US government, and the document also mentions North Korea and Russia, but I think it makes clear that the main security challenge comes from China. My second point is that there are many lines of effort included in the national security strategy, but I think essentially there are 3 central pillars, and those are number 1, China strategy, number 2, alliance/partnership strategy, and number 3, economic/technology security strategy. And these efforts, I think, will drive Japanese government to take a sort of a whole of government approach in the coming years. Moving on to the national defense strategy and the national build-up plan, I want to also make a couple of points. First, the Japanese government did not designate a particular name to characterize or describe the kind of force it aims to develop, and only refers to, quote unquote, fundamental reinforcement of defense capabilities in the document. But I think the most striking feature is that, as Chris mentioned, it declared Japan's intention to acquire counter-strike capabilities and also pursue active cyber defense. Both of these are new capabilities and approaches to proactively respond to threats through kinetic and non-kinetic means. And this goes beyond passively responding to incoming threats on and in the vicinity of the Japanese homeland, and instead aims to reinforce its defense capabilities so that Japan would be able to, quote unquote, disrupt and defeat invasion much earlier and at places further afield by approximately 2032. With regard to counter-strike capabilities, the national defense strategy and the national security strategy include identical paragraphs explaining the necessity, purpose, general employment principles, and legality of this new capability. I won't get into details, but this will involve various so-called standoff capabilities and other capabilities that are mentioned in the defense build-up plan. And they should also include equipping perhaps JMSDF ships with Tomahawk cruise missiles, possibly looking at 2026 and so. The government could have decided to mention this capability very briefly in the document, but this section is surprisingly long. And there is a sentence toward the end of the section that goes, and I quote, needless to say, preemptive strikes, namely striking first at a stage when no armed attack has occurred, remain impermissible, unquote. This is perhaps a way for the Japanese government to sort of reassure the public and also reassure the ruling coalition party that this is indeed a counter-strike capability and not a preemptive strike capability. My second related point has to do with this 5-year and 10-year timeline for 2027 and 2032. The most interesting part is from page 12 to page 13. It states that 5 years after the formulation of this strategy, Japan will strengthen its defense capability to the point where Japan is able to take primary responsibility for dealing with invasions against its nation and disrupt and defeat such threats with the support of its ally and others. By approximately 10 years from now, Japan will make further efforts to attain this defense objective and will reinforce its defense capabilities to the point where Japan is able to disrupt and defeat invasion much earlier, and at places further afield. Later on, it goes on to say that the top priorities for the next 5 years are twofold. First, to maximize effective use of its current equipment, Japan will improve operational rates, secure sufficient munitions and fuel, and accelerate investments in defense facilities for improved resiliency. And second, Japan will strengthen its core capabilities for future operations. Now, this is basically saying that Japan will need to work really hard over the next 5 years to improve SDF's readiness, which is said to be in a really bad state right now, and strive to acquire new capabilities over the next 10 years. Nikkei's Akita-san did a great piece yesterday, actually, that described the state of low readiness of the JSDF. It is said that the SDF is very low on parts. Its operational rate is at about 50% instead of 70 to 80%. The number of interceptors for missile defense is about 60% of what is required. And roughly 80% of SDF facilities remain unhardened and vulnerable. So it is said that out of the 43 trillion yen 5-year defense budget, roughly 15 trillion yen will be consumed to redress existing readiness issues. I should also note that new capabilities will require not only the hardware, but also organizing and deploying new units, conducting training and exercises that will take time to actually make them operational. So in sum, Japanese defense readiness will start from below the basic requirement level and has a long way to go to achieve full operational effectiveness. And that is all based on the condition that the projected defense budget gets full funding over multiple governments in the coming years. And this is a major political challenge. Lastly, on tasks ahead for the alliance. First, if Japan is going to acquire new capabilities such as counterstrike and develop the necessary doctrines and combined operational plans, as Chris mentioned, Japan and the U.S. defense authorities will need to further integrate targeting and planning processes, as well as achieve closer command and control arrangements. As the National Defense Strategy stipulates, closer coordination will be required in broad areas, ranging from air defense, anti-surface warfare, anti-submarine warfare, mine warfare, amphibious operations, airborne operations, and ISR targeting, as well as protection of assets and so forth. Second, joint capability development will also be a major effort that will need to be explored and further advanced. The National Defense Strategy states that in order to ensure the alliance's technological edge, interoperability readiness, and persistent warfare capabilities, Japan will further reinforce defense equipment and technology cooperation through joint analysis and joint research in cutting-edge technology, joint development, production of defense equipment, and so forth. There are existing bilateral cooperative initiatives that have been pursued, but I think it is ever possible, and if it is sensible, Japan should also explore the option of perhaps participating in some of the working groups in the AUKUS framework so as to mitigate the risks associated with researching and developing emerging technologies. Maybe hypersonics and counter-hypersonics would be one area that Japan should consider. Lastly, I believe that there is going to be a 2+2 meeting coming up soon that should authorize joint work ahead to strengthen the bilateral defense cooperation. But I think in addition to the existing bilateral frameworks, Japan might want to consider convening a Japan-US-Australia trilateral foreign and defense ministers meeting, or 2+2+2, with the aim of pursuing federated defense capabilities and force posture in the Indo-Pacific. Since we all want to invest wisely on defense and achieve multinational unity of effort to effectively and efficiently deter and balance against China on a sustainable basis, I think the three countries could coordinate more closely on many fronts related to defense and security in the Indo-Pacific. My sense is that China's A2AD threat ring, backed up by China's growing nuclear arsenal, is going to get more dense and wider in range. So we should think about the short-term implications, but also focus on the longer-term implications of this trend for our defense strategies. And I think we will become clear that Australia will also become a very important strategic ally. So I'll stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Me? Is it my turn? Okay. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about what to expect going forward. I think it's not a surprise to anyone for me to say that I expect fully for the North to continue to be on this path that it's been on, which is just being focused on expanding its nuclear and missile capabilities. Just in a few years since, after the failure of the Hanoi summit, we saw North Korea making qualitative and quantitative advancement on both of its nuclear missile programs. They're diversifying their missile arsenal. They have tested new missiles to really perfect. Their goal is to perfect their own missile and deterrent capabilities and to really defeat American missile defenses. So they need to get there. Adam mentioned October 3rd intermediate range ballistic missile test and the North carried out, which was the third time the North Korea launched this kind of ballistic missile designed to carry a nuclear warhead over Japanese territory. Then we all saw on November 18th, Hwasong-17, the largest road mobile liquid fueled ICBM in the world. But why this missile is notable is that it is designed to carry multiple warheads, right? Carrying up to 4 nuclear warheads, which means North Korea is one step closer to having this ability to one day to accommodate multiple warheads payloads which will allow the North to really overcome U.S. missile defenses. So this is their goal, right? And this so-called MIRV capacity, for example, will frustrate our U.S. missile defenses and really enhance North Korea's ability to strike U.S. mainland with nuclear missiles, making North Korea just one of the 3 countries in the world, along with Russia and China, to possess this dangerous capability. At the party plenum last week, I think it was just last week, the North signaled that a solid fuel ICBMs would be now their top development priority in 2023, which means there's a very good chance that Kim Jong-un will order this test of these new ICBMs even in the coming months. He could, for example, launch one in a sort of a full range trajectory for the first time, rather than a lofted trajectory, as Kim Yo-jong recently warned. So there's no reason not to expect that. At the same time, we know that North Korea is working on missiles that can launch faster, they're more difficult to detect, and they're harder for ballistic missiles to stop, missile defenses to stop. We also know that all the indications are there that in terms of likelihood of the North conducting the 7th nuclear test that we've been all waiting for, to possibly showcase a smaller, more compact next generation tactical nuclear warhead for battlefield use, which obviously would increase threat to South Korea and Japan. We don't know why they have not conducted this test yet, but our assumption is that they will soon enough conduct this test. North Korea's Punggye-ri site appears completely ready for detonation, basically at any time. Again, we're not sure why they have not tested yet, but all the indications are that they could absolutely test in the coming months. But what's also notable, in addition to North Korea just continually on this path of qualitatively really refining and quantitatively expanding their missile forces, they've been really, and this has been my concern, is that they've been really focused on developing tactical nuclear weapons intended for use against targets on or near the peninsula, Korean peninsula. I absolutely expect this focus on tactical nuclear weapons to also continue. They've outlined this in their 5-year development plan. North Korea is seeking smaller, more miniaturized nuclear warheads and a short-range missile for tactical use. What is also very concerning is that the Kim regime at the same time has been threatening to launch a preemptive attack, right? Focus on tactical nuclear weapons. Sort of taking a page right out of Putin's playbook, they've been threatening preemptive use. And then we saw this new nuclear law that they announced on September 9th, when they announced 5 conditions in which they would launch a preemptive strike, effectively really starting a new first use doctrine for nuclear weapons, and really dramatically lowering the threshold for use, the nuclear weapons use. The conditions for nuclear weapons uses does not only include when a nuclear attack is imminent, but when there is perceived preparations of a non-nuclear strike on leadership or nuclear command structure and more important strategic targets. So combined, I'm very concerned. We have now a new law. Kim Jong-un sought to really further cement nuclear power status, saying North Korea would never give up nuclear weapons, calling its program now irreversible and non-negotiable. So I also expect this sense to not change for the foreseeable future. Some people say, there's always this kind of cycle that North Korea goes through, but I don't think that they're at any point in the foreseeable future interested in returning to dialogue. And North Korea declaring that the North will never abandon its nuclear arsenal and that it will remain a nuclear state, that's not surprising, right? But we've seen this since 2012 when North Korea amended the constitution to talk about North Korea's nuclear status. But what is noteworthy is that now that Kim Jong-un is asserting basically that North Korea will never again engage in talks that are premised on denuclearization, while introducing this new nuclear law that enshrines its nuclear status. So through this new legislation, North Korea basically has laid the legal groundwork that there will be no future talks about denuclearization, while dramatically, again, lowering the threshold for use of nuclear weapons. So I don't expect anytime soon, unfortunately, for us to sort of turn to any kind of peace phase or even a negotiation phase. And the reason I expect more provocations this year is because I also believe that geopolitical environment is actually favorable for North Korea and the Kim regime to continue down on this path of nuclear and missile provocations and expanding and modernizing their missile arsenal. We have intensified U.S.-China competition. We have the war in Ukraine, which really only made the world increasingly more bifurcated. We are seeing uneasy alliance between Xi Jinping and Putin, and this tightening of relationship between China and Russia and North Korea. North Korea has recently even boasted about its close relationship with China and having been sending artillery to Russia to aid the Ukraine war. And we've also seen China and Russia unwilling to implement sanctions. But even going further, I believe they're just not going to cooperate with Washington and the international community to either enforce sanctions or to do anything else. Both Beijing and Moscow have even vetoed any further action on North Korea at the UN Security Council, even if in the aftermath of these several ICBM launches, including Hwasong-17, United Nations Security Council could not even issue a formal statement because of the opposition from China and Russia. And then, of course, we call this, blatant obstructionism from China and Russia. And I expect fully that this environment to continue. So even additional nuclear tests, the 7th nuclear test by North Korea, I think would be unlikely to prompt a serious reaction from China and Russia. So this really marks a critical juncture in regional dynamics, where now Beijing and Moscow now views Pyongyang's provocations as a means to gain an advantage over Washington, rather than a concerning threat to regional stability. So my point is, North Korea has a wide open pathway to further testing and escalation without any fear of serious consequences. So why not? If I'm Kim Jong-un myself, I will continue down this path. So what do we do in this environment? And this kind of shifting geostrategic landscape obviously calls for U.S. and South Korea to strengthen regional defense through an alliance-focused strategy, which requires close coordination between Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo. On theater missile defense, on military exercises like the one on the trilateral anti-submarine exercises they conducted for the first time in 5 years in September, and ballistic exercises, intelligence sharing, all critical must-dos for the Biden administration, Yoon administration, and the Kishida government. At least here, I would say, thankfully, we're seeing some progress, right? Knowing just the Korea-Japan relationship. In past November, we saw Japan and South Korea held I think it was the first in-person former official summit in 3 years in Cambodia. President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida have both pledged to at least improve the bilateral relationship that was very strained in recent years. So I think the bottom line here is we have a bad news on North Korea, but we have some positive news when it comes to the trilateral relationship. U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral relationship is one of the most obviously important relationship in the region for the United States, and each of our security alliances provides deterrence and assures defense of Japan and South Korea. So together they provide the foundation of deterring North Korean aggression. And here I think we have a little bit of a positive news on that front. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but at least we can take baby steps on that front.
All right, I think it's my turn now, and I'll finish up, and after that, that's quite a talk to follow. So thank you so much for inviting me, particularly to Adam Liff and the staff of the 21st Century Japanese Politics and Society Initiative. Thank you so much. as well as to Chris Johnstone. And I've really enjoyed this conversation thus far. Much of it has been quite sobering. And in my comments, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and address some of the issues of economic security, and particularly how Japan's economic and business concerns intersect with national security concerns, how that's reflected in policy, and how we expect to see that moving forward in the coming year. So over the past year, to give a little bit of context, Japan has made explicit moves towards formalizing this nexus of economic and security issues in policy. In late 2021, Prime Minister Kishida created a new ministerial level position for economic security, an economic security minister. And in 2022, Japan passed Explicit Economic Security Promotion Act, or Promotion Bill, I'll call it ESPA, that is starting to come into effect now. So this economic security legislation, there are 4 different goals in the bill. The first is protecting sensitive intellectual property, particularly IP that could be related to dual use technologies, or perhaps also other areas of strategic competition in foreign relations. The second is to strengthen cybersecurity and critical infrastructure, other critical infrastructure protections. Beyond domestic protection of critical industries and critical infrastructure, an additional goal of this legislation in some of these areas is to be able to more deeply cooperate with the United States in research, in technologies, and as well as the production of industries that are in sensitive areas or areas that might require security clearance. The third area in the bill is promoting public-private partnerships and research and development, particularly, again, for critical technologies like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, as well as protecting against data leakage in these sorts of sensitive sectors to other countries or perhaps bad actors. And the fourth is supply chain resiliency or supply chain security, something that's also been pursued with other initiatives prior to 2022 from the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, the Japan External Trade Organization, and other state-funded organizations. The issue of supply chain security, I'll talk about a little bit more. In the ESPA, it gives the Japanese government new tools for industrial policies, state intervention in the economy to support strategic industries, likely from sectors like semiconductors, batteries, critical minerals, perhaps also biomedical products like personal protective equipment, perhaps vaccine manufacturing, things like this. The specific industries that are going to be supported will be decided at the cabinet level in the Prime Minister's office. And so this is something that we will see moving forward, exactly which industries become critical, although we already have some clues that I'll talk about. One goal of these initiatives, these supply chain security initiatives, whether it's via the Economic Security Act or MEDI-JETRO initiatives that have already been implemented, is to give the Japanese government more tools to support firms, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, to either return production to Japan to reshore it, or, and this is, I think, more likely, to diversify production out of China to Southeast Asia. And there's some evidence that this is already starting to happen to some extent, and we'll see if, moving forward, if these new tools start to accelerate any of the trends. Although some of the very early financial support that the Japanese government has given to firms, either to reshore or to diversify, to lessen dependence on China particularly, were reactions to early pandemic shortages. For example, we saw companies being funded in mask production, for example, early in the pandemic. The roots of the economic security legislation really predate the pandemic. That is not what it's about. Drafting of this began in 2019. The core ideas in the legislation date to the 1980s. So much of this is older. Economic security and specifically implementation of the ESPA is also explicitly written into the new national security strategy. As Mori Sensei commented, this is a whole of government approach. We see economic security broadly brought into national security concerns. There's an explicit turn towards more industrial policy in the economic security space in the national security document, right? Quoting it, says they will promote capital reinforcement of private enterprises with critical goods and technologies and strengthen the function of policy-based finance in pursuit of protecting and nurturing critical goods. There's also mention in the national security strategy to increase screening mechanisms for investments in dual use technologies. Some of this is, to some extent, is written into the economic security bill, but I do think that it's interesting that that language is in the new document, because explicit investments, inbound investment screening, though it was discussed in early deliberations and drafts of the legislation, didn't actually make it into the final law. Japan doesn't have a sort of CSIS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, a CSIS-like mechanism like the United States does to screen these kinds of inbound investments. And so they will be screening infrastructure projects and things to a certain extent in the legislation. But if the national security strategy is calling for additional screening, this is something that I'll be watching moving forward in 2023 and beyond. Some of these supply chain resiliency, as well as information and infrastructure initiatives in the bill, were written in order to facilitate deeper cooperation with the United States, particularly with defense-related production or research in technology areas like quantum computing, 6G, artificial intelligence, and more things. And in particular, in ones that are done by the Department of Defense or that are part of defense contracts. So there's a lot of room for cooperation there, but in other respects, there are real points of market competition between US and Japanese manufacturers, as well as very real differences in opinion on the question of decoupling from China. And it's unclear to what extent cooperation and market competition are going to be able to coexist. Right? If the private firms will have the full buy-in they need to make this work. One of the things I was asked to talk about is the extent to which this economic security issues are how much they're all about China. And in some ways, yes, the economic security issues in Japan is all about China. The National Security Strategy document states that Japan will, I'm quoting here, Japan will curb excessive dependence on specific countries, carry forward next generation semiconductor development and manufacturing bases, secure stable supply for critical goods, including rare earths. These two industries mentioned, chips and rare earths, are both areas where Japanese policymakers are quite concerned about relying on imports from a specific country, China. In the rare earths case, Japan was burned by China's de facto or unclaimed export ban in 2010. In the case of semiconductors, reliance on Chinese manufacturing is risky, especially given increasingly stringent US controls on doing business with large Chinese semiconductor firms, particularly ramping up over the last couple of months. In the recent cabinet shuffle in Japan, Sanae Takaichi was named the new economic security minister. She's broadly considered a China hawk, more so, I would argue, than former Minister Kobayashi Takayuki. These particular sectors, as well as this shuffle, I think are signals that economic frictions between Japan and China may start to rise in 2023. But that said, it's really not all about China. Economic security is also about having supply chains that are resilient to all sorts of disruptions. It's not just geopolitics. Domestic natural disasters, floods in Thailand, global pandemics, all of these things can cause great economic harm. And much of this legislation is about avoiding economic disruptions in key industries like automobiles that are central to Japan's prosperity, regardless of any sort of strategic competition with its powerful neighbor. And I'll wrap up my comments there, and I look forward to the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to all the panelists for covering really a tremendous amount of ground in such a short period of time. That was fantastic, at times optimistic and encouraging, but also at times extraordinarily sobering. I think one thing we can all agree on is that there's a lot of work to do, and that these new strategic documents are in many ways only a beginning. Before I engage the panel discussion, I'd just like to remind our audience that you can now submit your questions through the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Because of our very large audience tonight, I hope you'll forgive me for paraphrasing and combining questions. I will ask all questions anonymously, so please don't be shy, especially you students out there. When submitting your questions, though, it would help me out if you could please be concise and clearly indicate the panelists to whom you are directing your question. Thank you. Okay, so Chris, I think my first question is for you. I've read these documents a couple of times now and watched with no shortage of frustration a lot of the public commentary asserting a fundamental change having taken place overnight. But even Japan's own national security strategy ends with a section that candidly acknowledges, and I'll even quote from the unofficial English translation here, that this strategy will fulfill its complete purpose only when its contents are executed. I interpret that as an indirect acknowledgement that a lot of the new investments and capabilities making headlines today will actually take a very long time to come online, even if everything goes according to plan. And my own view is that is hardly a political or budgetary certainty. So my question for you is this. Based on your years at the Pentagon and the NSC working with Japanese colleagues, could you share with our audience what a realistic timeline is for Japan to bring some of these major new capabilities online, especially counterstrike? And especially as it concerns strike and other new issues, how urgent do you think the need is for a new bilateral defense guidelines? Or is the 2015 one good enough that it's still got significant legs?
Great questions, Adam. And again, really impressive presentations from the whole panel. Look, I'd say a couple things. I think as a first point, there's a clear intent on the part of the Japanese government to move out as quickly as possible. So, for example, the budget request for the next fiscal year, so the first year of this 5-year buildup that's been announced, reflects a 25% increase in the budget over the current year. That by itself is remarkable and unprecedented. And it's focused on some things that Japan intends to try to do quickly, like including in particular the sustainability category that I mentioned, building up munition stocks, improving the readiness of the existing force. On the strike question, there's also an intent to move quickly, but you're right that this will take time. I think there is a goal of having Tomahawk cruise missiles on Japanese destroyers in the 2026 timeframe. So that's a couple of years from now, 3 years or so from now. That's probably ambitious, but not impossible, particularly if the plan is to rely on a lot of the U.S. architecture that would support intelligence, targeting, damage assessment, critical to making a strike capability credible. Some of the other things, though, you're quite right, Adam, are going to take time and will require new legislation. This range of things related to cybersecurity and active cyber defense. There's talk of revamping an organization that's called the NISC, which is basically a National Incident Response Center for cyber, making that basically creating a new organization with stronger authorities. That will require new legislation. This active defense capability will take time to develop. It's not even clear to me, perhaps Mori Sensei knows, where this capability will be housed, who will have authority over it. So I think you will see some quick near-term steps and some significant ones, including related to strike, but this is a long-term arc and it will take time. Last quick point on your question on the defense guidelines, which is the document that sort of sets out the roles and missions of U.S. forces and the Japan Self-Defense Force. I do think at some point, not right away, perhaps, at some point we'll need a revision, I believe, to address specifically the question of strike. What are the circumstances in which a Japanese strike capability can be employed? What is the connection of that capability to collective self-defense? How is the decision-making about the use of that capability going to be made? These are pretty complicated questions that will take some time for the allies to begin to work through, but I think will eventually need to be written down in some form, and the guidelines does seem like a way to do it. So those are some initial thoughts. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. On that last point, I've seen some media reporting in the last couple of weeks suggesting that those conversations are already underway, albeit behind closed doors. It's a long ways away to perhaps a public guidelines encapsulation of those discussions. But Satoru, I'd like to follow up with a related question for you about the domestic politics in Japan of all these ambitious commitments, which I think was implied by some of your comments. For example, I think there's a fair amount of evidence of strong opposition to many of the fundraising measures currently under consideration, like raising taxes. And this opposition manifests both among the general public, but even in some parts of the LDP itself. This shouldn't be too surprising. There are a lot of reasons why Japan's defense budget hasn't gone up much the past decade, and not all of them are ideological. Many of them are fiscal or political or some other factor. mean, after all, we're talking about plans for a tremendous amount of new funding for defense in a country with a lot of public debt, major demographic headwinds, among other challenges. So my question for you is this: how realistic do you think it is to expect that over the next 5 to 10 years, Japan's leaders can pull this off, both fiscally and politically? How confident are you, for example, that Japan will meet its pledges to increase the defense budget by 60 to 65% between now and 2027?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Adam. I used to be a little bit more optimistic about this issue a couple months ago, but I think looking at what's happened since then, I'm not so optimistic right now. I think they'll try to achieve this 2% GDP target, by adding on various kinds of funding on this defense expenditure. But I think, as you mentioned, there are three currently sources of funding: tax increase, debt financing, reallocation of resources. They call it the 無駄な歳出を減らす, which is like cutting unneeded spending, which is essentially a reallocation of resources from non-defense to defense budget. And also they're actually going to create this defense capability enhancement fund to sort of fund this increase. For the tax increase, I think it becomes a sustainable source of funding, but it's going to be very heavy political lifting for the prime minister to actually achieve this. Debt financing, I think this is relatively politically more easier, but as you mentioned, we already have a very extremely high level of debt already. And I think the Bank of Japan is now purchasing some of these public debt issued by the Japanese government. So they don't want to see, they're probably opposed to this debt financing scheme. Reallocation of resources, you'll probably see inter-ministry politics playing out and so forth. So for all these sources of funding, there will be opposition to actually make them realize. So it's ultimately going to be the political, how should I say, capital of the prime minister to be able to actually push through a certain scheme. And I think right now, he's now moving on to the tax increase line of effort, and there will be opposition. And some of the people who argue against this tax increase make several arguments, saying that from an economic perspective, some say that it's not right for a tax increase due to negative effects it may have on the Japanese economy that is now experiencing rising costs and so forth. But if we completely postponed the tax increase to 2024 or 2025 even, national elections will appear on the horizon, right? And it will make it even more difficult for the administration to actually push for this kind of funding. One option could be to wait until after the next national elections for the tax increase, but the Japanese national debt is very huge to fund in the short term. So in any case, I think it's going to ultimately depend on where the prime minister, what kind of political capital he will have. Right now, Prime Minister's approval rating is not that high. So I just hope that he will be able to, kind of gather a sort of a package of various sources of funding, maybe tax increase complemented by this defense enhancement fund, and also some reserves from the end of the fiscal year, as well as, reallocation budget from non-defense to defense. But we'll have to see. I'm not so optimistic, but we'll have to see what happens. I think with the Ministry of Finance, they have already actually have an actual package to kind of fund the current programs. And I just will have to see what happens on the political side from now on. So, but I'll just end with this not so optimistic note that I'm not so optimistic as I used to be a couple of months ago. So I'll end there. Yeah.
Thanks. And I think that's just another example of the ways in which these documents and these pledges are just the beginning. There's a lot of politics that has yet to unfold. Thanks, Satoru. Okay, so Sue, next I'd like to turn to you. You talked a bit about, towards the end of your remarks, about your guarded optimism for more cooperation between Japan and Korea. Over the last couple of weeks, there have been a number of media reports about the possibility, for example, of real-time sharing of radar information between Japan and South Korea about North Korean missiles. This idea is not new, but some seem to think the time is finally right. Can I ask, what's your view on how likely this is to happen in the short term? From an American perspective, it maybe seems like an obvious thing for these two close U.S. allies to do, especially given the different positioning of their tracking system, which allows them to see different things. But what's your understanding of the sensitivities in Seoul about this sort of agreement in 2023?
I mean, sensitivities are there. Maybe after I answer your question, I saw that on the Q&A, somebody was asking about also a question on, how long can we expect this policy to continue, because it seems to change from government to government, and what can we do to ensure that it doesn't change when the administration now changes to a different administration who might have a different policy when it comes to Japan about domestic constraints. It's sensitive, it's still there. Why I say I think we're still having more of a positive momentum is because where the Korean public is, right? Not only a North Korean threat, which is obvious, we've seen increased threat in the past year, and again, focus on tactical nuclear weapons and everything else that got Koreans. I think you all understand the threat from North Korea, but even on China, right? When you see all the recent polls, we have some 80%. I think South Korea right now has the most negative view on China than any place in the world. And this way is above Japan, which is surprising, but this has been the trend, and this is where we are. So yes, there is still sensitivity, and there's always this Japan card that people can exploit. But why I see a little bit of positive momentum, including your question on radar, I'm not sure exactly I don't have a specific answer to that. But what I am seeing is both in the Yoon administration, there's at least an intent, followed by at least with the public, and public perception and public's view is shifting and changing. So there is an opportunity here. Now, to answer this one question, I just saw that question. I can't read it exactly. I think it was about, how it keeps changing in South Korea, right? But which is true. But it's not either a conservative or progressive, because, Lee Myung-bak, while there was an intel sharing agreement under Lee Myung-bak, but it was Lee Myung-bak who also went to Lianco Rocks and caused great controversy, right? President Park Geun-hye, under her, we had a conformant agreement. Okay, President Moon Jae-in really scrapped that, but it was also the progressive President Kim Dae-jung, and under Kim Dae-jung, it was Korea-Japan relationship. We saw it was sort of the height of the relationship when we saw some sort of breakthrough. So it's not a progressive thing necessarily or a conservative thing, but it is leadership dependent. I don't know the answer to how to change the domestic environment, but I'll just, by reiterating, the Korean public sentiment is shifting and changing against China. And I do think that is an important variable. And then I would say, when you look at the times that Korea-Japan relationship was good, like under Kim Dae-jung, during the whole Kim Dae-jung Obuchi Declaration, 1998, and the 2002, co-hosting of the World Cup and whatnot. When you look at what was happening, there was a 1998 financial crisis. There was North Korean missile threats. So when there's external environment that is, it can push the two countries together. Right. And now we just spend entire time just talking about shifting geopolitical environment on just threat perception with China, with North Korea, and everything else that's going on. I think that's why I say I see some baby steps, just some positive momentum there. Again, I'm also been doing this for a very long time, so I'm not too optimistic, and I'm always a little bit skeptical too. But still, this is as good as we can get it, I think, both in terms of public sentiment and where we are with the leadership.
Thank you. So before we open things up to the audience, Kristen, and thank you for your patience, one last question from me about economic security. Could you say just a bit more about how you expect discussions on economic security cooperation to play out over the next year or so? What are some areas where cooperation is likely to be relatively smooth sailing between the U.S. and Japan, and where should we expect there to be more friction? How concerned should we be about this becoming an area of significant tension in the relationship?
Yeah, thank you. So a lot of the way the economic security legislation was written reflects partnerships that the United States and Japan have been pursuing for a long time. So in some ways, I expect to see fairly straightforward cooperation, because there's these particular areas of particularly critical minerals and batteries, magnets, that the United States and Japan have been talking about building cooperative supply chains and trying to build more resilience. I guess I would probably track the recent history back to the 2019 Suga visit and the core partnership. And then there's many similar initiatives since then. I have a list of, I think, 6 and 7 in my notes, but and that's just a sampling. Right. So we have a lot of, I think expect a lot of cooperation there. But then there are some pretty fundamental places where the U.S. and Japanese, both the sort of the public discourse and policymakers, but then also the private sector are seeing things pretty differently. And that's where I'm not sure if we'll see outright contention, but I do think that we will not see the stated goals of things like the decoupling policies or some of the more hawkish policies, economic policies from the United States, or the real reshoring policies, or China plus one diversification policies from Japanese policymakers are not going to be implemented at a rate that policymakers might want. And as I mentioned in my remarks, there is a lot of resistance to really decouple from China. It would be very costly for the Japanese economy to try and do so. Japan is still highly reliant on many imports. And does final product manufacturing in China as well. And there have been movements, the China zero COVID policy, I think even more than some of the geopolitical things and the human rights pressures and overdependence pressures, et cetera, were very frustrating for Japanese firms, and firms have started to look into Southeast Asia and in India, finding new partners in order to build a more resilient economy. But that's going to be, I think, slower going than particularly U.S. policymakers would like, but probably Japanese policymakers as well.
Okay, thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everyone. I could keep asking questions of this panel for a very long time. But we definitely want to hear from our global audience. So let's now start the audience Q&A. With apologies to all questioners, in the interest of clarity and brevity, I will paraphrase or combine your questions, but I'll try my best to capture their basic spirit. And I'll be pulling from both questions that came in through the registration page and from live questions, so please do keep them coming. Our first audience question comes from a retired U.S. general, and I think I'd like to direct this to Chris and Satoru. I know this relates to something on the minds of a lot of folks in Washington and Tokyo these days, especially given recent reporting about Japan's plans for a joint command. So the question that came in is, what are the prospects for Japan's efforts to enhance jointness across the ground, maritime, and air self-defense forces to achieve real progress in the short to medium term? And for context, our questioner asks, shares his view that the lack of jointness has been an important obstacle in the JSDF's ability to work seamlessly with the U.S. and others. As he writes, you must first become truly joint before you can effectively fight in a combined allied environment. For starters, a shared common operating picture is essential for information intelligence, operational, and target sharing. So if I could, given some of the capabilities Japan's just announced it plans to pursue, this seems to be an even more pressing priority, not just for Japan, but also for U.S.-Japan allied interoperability and deterrence. So what are your thoughts on this topic? How quickly do you think Japan can bring these capabilities online? Satoru, do you want to start us off?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the question. I think pursuing jointness is already a sort of a goal for the JSDF to achieve. It's been pursued for a long time. And now they're looking at establishing this joint command within the JSDF. U.S. and Japanese forces have traditionally developed this air-to-air, sea-to-sea, ground-to-ground connections. But with this new emerging systems incorporating, AI and the various kinds of new emerging technologies into this joint, U.S. is pursuing this JADC2, right? Joint all domain command and control. And this is going to be a new model that will be kind of controlling and commanding U.S. forces. And I think Japan will have to look at achieving a similar sort of system on the Japanese side, so that Indo-Pacific Command will have its counterpart on the Japanese side, and to be able to effectively initiate and implement combined operations through joint operations. And I think that's the goal that both sides are looking at. I'm not quite sure what the timeline would be. It's not easy, obviously, for any military to achieve jointness, because there are various kind of obstacles, including organizational cultures and so forth. But that's the direction that Japan is looking at, and probably the U.S. as well. But I would also want to defer to Chris about how the U.S. is looking at this issue, if that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought those were terrific points from Morty Sensei. I mean, I think the U.S. side too is encouraged by the announcement in these documents of the intent to establish a permanent joint headquarters and to separate it from the existing Joint Staff Office, so that they're now sort of more or less along the U.S. lines. There is the Joint Staff Office will be the military advisor to Japan's civilian leadership. And then there will be the standing permanent joint headquarters, which will oversee joint SDF operations across all the services. I think that's a very welcome change. I will say it's not new. This has been an idea that's long discussed and long delayed. I know the intent is to have this command up and established by 2027. But it's an ambitious enterprise. I do think, I guess the additional point that I would make on top of Mori Sensei's remarks is, and this goes back to my point about as Japan implements and realizes the vision in its documents, I do think there's a need to rethink U.S. command and control and to have a more joint operational command on the U.S. side in Japan that interfaces with this new command that's coming in Japan. But this is still some years away. Last point I just make very quickly, there's a manpower issue for the SDF as well that I would point to, right? We've talked about this, the possibility of 60% growth in the defense budget in 5 years. There is no plan to increase the size of the SDF itself. So all of this change will have to be carried out by essentially the existing workforce. That's a daunting challenge. Now there's some plan for reallocation of personnel across services. My understanding is 2,000 or so GSDF personnel will sort of, at least their billets will move to the MSDF and the ASDF, but that's not a lot of change, and certainly not a change in the top line. So the human capacity to implement all of this is one of the challenges on Japan's plate. But it's one that's well recognized. I mean, it is understood in MOD that they have to make more creative use of contracting, outsourcing, leveraging civilian expertise, and so on. Thanks.
Thanks. And I think on top of that, recruiting more women into the self-defense forces has been a stated priority for a number of years now. Needless to say, I think this question of jointness is going to get a lot more attention in the coming years. For my next question, I'd like to
quick on that.
Sorry.
Can I just jump really on the question
of
jointness? So one of the things in the economic security legislation is trying to facilitate, in particular with this emergence of these new technologies, that Japanese firms and Japanese companies will be able to develop domestic technologies, because there has been this problem with them not being able to have proper security clearance in order to cooperate on the U.S. side. And so recognizing that problem, that was one of the things that the legislation is trying to be able to build domestic capability in Japan that will increase military jointness, cooperation with the United States as well. And I'm optimistic that will move forward.
Okay, thanks, Kristen. So I'd like to turn to Sue, since we're getting a lot of questions about Japan-Korea relations. As you noted in your remarks, the Yoon administration seems to have taken a very different approach to Japan than its predecessor, and there's a lot of reason for some optimism today, however guarded, about prospects for more trilateral security cooperation than at any point, certainly that I can recall, maybe since even before the Park administration. But you also, in your response, touched on this really important idea that it's not just about being a progressive administration versus a conservative administration. I think that doesn't get enough attention in the discourse, so I appreciate you highlighting that. But since so many of our audience members have asked, I feel compelled to follow up. One of our members points out that some Korean progressives have already expressed concern about deepening cooperation with Japan under President Yoon, as well as Japan's new national security strategy and counterstrike capabilities in particular. Now, especially since many of these capabilities are probably going to take years to come online, by which point we may have a new administration in South Korea. How do you think we should understand the domestic political environment in Seoul as it relates to these issues today? Is there a clearer divide between conservative and progressive governments today than, say, there may have been back in the Kim Dae-jung era? Does that point hold up over time? Sue, you're muted.
You think I know this by now after umpteen Zoom calls. It's true. I mean, I guess the last, Kim Dae-jung is pretty far back, but again, I would like to remind, Lee Myung-bak was not so far back, and why everybody thought this was such a great thing, and he did great thing, and the whole inter-sharing and all of that, and then he's ultimately the one who ended up going to Lianco Rocks, right? So I do think it's leadership dependent, but I'm hesitant to just call it a progressive thing or a conservative thing. I really think it depends on who will be the next president. But it is true. I think the progressive faction in South Korea right now are the ones who are sort of pushing back on it, and there's a domestic component to it. But then Yoon administration would push back on that and therefore say, because we still have 4 years, let's say, instead of sort of worrying about that 4 years from now, why can't we just make some sort of progress now when it's possible? So I do think I'm not going to sit here and sort of guarantee or say one thing or another. I have no idea who's going to become president. Predicting South Korean politics it's worse than U.S. or any other country. So I will not go there. I have no idea. And domestic politics is always there, and using Japan card is always there. And the Japanese have every right to be concerned. But I would point out again, if the momentum right now, let's look at right now what Korea and Japan and U.S. can accomplish today. And instead of trying to lock something in that's unrealistic, it's a false promise. I think if we can get to a better space in 4 years, and again, as I said, the public opinion is also shifting, there is still a better place to be at 4 years from now, whoever comes in. And that person can replace Yoon and try to, hey, we don't know what's going to happen in the United States ourselves. So we can't make this kind of predictions. All we can do is what we can do today, given who we have in the office today and what the public sentiment is today, is what I would say. You're on mute now.
It's always a dangerous errand to try to predict the future, of course. So our next question is about Japan-China relations. So I'd like to direct it to Kristen, though I'd of course welcome any other panelists to chime in. And the question is very concise, which is always appreciated, but it also allows you to interpret it however you'd like. And the question is this: should we be optimistic or pessimistic about Japan-China relations in 2023, and why or why not? Kristen, what do you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of different directions that we could go here. So thinking, maybe I'll answer this briefly from an economic perspective, and then pass it over maybe to Mori-sensei. Maybe you could think a little bit more about the security projections. I think so. Business cooperation has occasionally been rocky between Japan and China, but often has been the thing that's an anchor in the relationship that has persisted even through the rocky periods. And the last 3 years have been very rough for doing business in China, and we'll see what happens now that zero COVID has ended, and whether Japanese companies are optimistic about their continue to be highly invested, and whether that will continue to be the core of the relationship, the positive relationship. I'm leaning pessimistic right now, thinking about that. I mean, I said that earlier that there's a lot of resistance to decoupling. I think that's true, but in terms of the sentiment towards the business environment and robust trade and investment relations with China right now, it's not looking so rosy.
Shall I go? Okay, all right, thank you. On diplomatic issues, security issues, I don't see any fundamental improvement in Japan-China relations. Senkaku situation is here to stay, I think. I think Chinese actions that we have concerns also regarding Taiwan Strait and so forth is not going to change, I don't think. So perhaps the foreign minister might have meetings with his counterpart in China, but they'll talk, but outstanding issues will not be resolved. I don't think China has any intention to make concessions or whatever with regard to security issues and so forth. On other cooperative issues, I think I'm not quite sure whether we can call it cooperation because Japan, US will be taking certain policies, China will be taking certain policies, for example, in climate and so forth. But that's basically each country taking its own policy, pursuing its own policy, and it's not really about negotiations and making compromises and so forth. So in that sense, I don't think there's going to be a fundamental breakthrough over security issues or political issues that both countries have concerns over. So that would be my view for 2023 right now. Thanks.
Thank you. I think I basically share that, but if nothing else, perhaps one can reasonably hope for more active diplomacy, especially now that China is opening up a bit more. But where that goes, who knows? So our next question, and this may end up being our last question, I think I'd like to direct it to Chris, especially drawing on his experiences in the government during the Abe era. So the question that came in is what is the U.S. expectation of Japan's role in cooperation over intelligence? Historically, as Kristen noted in her earlier response, U.S. concerns about leaks have been a major obstacle to some forms of cooperation with Japan over the years. Where are we today? The Secrets Protection Act was a long time ago while you're still in government. And given the concern, what realistic expectation can the U.S. have in the years to come?
Yeah, a very good question. I think a fair assessment would be that we've made a lot of progress in this area over the last number of years. And the Secrets Protection Act of 2016, I think, is sort of the biggest example of that. But there's been an ongoing bilateral quiet dialogue on information security for more than 10 years at this point. And I think it is achieving results, particularly in areas related to things like space and cyber, that are going to enable deeper cooperation than has been there before. I do think it's fair to say, right, there's this discussion out there about should Japan become a member of Five Eyes. I think that conversation is still premature, but I think that there are obligations on both sides. I think Japan has more work to do in certain areas. Actually, the national security strategy is quite clear about what some of those areas are, including the steps related to strengthening cybersecurity and the protection of government networks and so on. That's very welcome and will be well received. I think on the U.S. side, we have not done a great job of setting out the end state. In other words, if Japan does X, Y, and Z, the following benefits will result. And so I think offering a clearer roadmap for what specific steps that Japan might take and what specific forms of cooperation would result from those steps would be a useful thing for us to do. I mean, I do think getting the information security dynamic bilaterally better is a vital task going forward. I talked about how the steps that Japan has signaled it will take related to strike and other capabilities invite a much more integrated alliance. That's the opportunity here, is a much more integrated U.S.-Japan alliance, but reaching a common understanding and a common set of standards on information security will be critical to getting there. So that's also part of the homework for the future. A lot of progress, but more to be done. And I think the U.S. side owes more of a map about the way ahead.
Thank you, Chris. So especially given the late time here on the US East Coast, and I do try to make a point of ending our events on time. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the webinar. I'd like to start by thanking our panelists for sharing your time and expertise with our global audience. This was truly a fantastic discussion. I think we should do this every January 5th. I'd also like to offer special thank yous to Satoru, who helped me brainstorm this event in Tokyo many months ago, and to Chris Johnstone, and of course the CSIS Japan Chair team for their co-sponsorship and willingness to collaborate. I certainly hope this collaboration is not our last. And of course, thank you to our audience for participating. Chris, would you like to add anything?
Just want to echo everything you just said, Adam. It's been a delight to collaborate with you on this. Look forward to many more opportunities in the future. And my deep thanks to our other panelists, Kristen, Sue, Satoru. It's been terrific, and Adam, look forward to more in the future. So thanks to everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, everybody. Have a wonderful night or a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.